and I'm delighted to be the host of today's event dedicated to digital surveillance and various norms and policies that governments across the board and across the globe try to figure out how to navigate this new emerging and very important space. And I'm delighted to have my colleague, Steven Feldstein, who's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, DC, to accompany me in this journey. Steve has a very rich career, has worked on Capitol Hill, has worked at the State Department, and is now with us at Carnegie. Welcome, Steve.
I'm delighted to be here.
Terrific. This project Carnegie Endowment does together with the US Embassy to Russia, and the whole idea was to bring people real time to Russia, but it's not possible because of COVID, so that's the new reality we all live in. But it also amplifies the importance of the subject that we are discussing, because various forms of AR surveillance have been with us for a number of years now. We know that there is a very vivid and active experiment with China, with a lot of cameras, a lot of AI-powered algorithms that enable face recognition. There are multiple experiments and practices in European capitals. I think that London is one of the global leaders. We also have that in the United States, in Russia, in many countries. And the perennial question is the boundary and the balance between public interests and private liberties. And then on top of that came COVID-19, with the new drive for contact tracing and various use of access to data by the governments and companies to enable a mechanism needed to protect public health. So here we have another dimension when there is a very important public interest, health at stake, and at the same time there is risk that all of these new tools will infringe on people's liberties. So Steve, you've dedicated a lot of your time writing, thinking about this subject. And I think that on top of that, we are in very interesting juncture in global debate about this, because we have approach and ideas formulated by some authoritarian governments that are seen as countries that have done really well through the pandemic. Look at China, the numbers are pretty low. And I think that the talking point that the Chinese government is constantly using is that these digital surveillance mechanisms are part of China's success in dealing with the pandemic. And then the use is also very widespread in going after some criminals or just preventing basic crimes. So that's a very strong advertisement for this model. And then on the other side, there is the incoming Biden administration, where if I read carefully what President-elect has to say about his foreign policy priorities, spreading democracy, supporting human rights is one of the key tasks that he sets for his national security team. And definitely regulation of the global commons, including the digital domain, is one of the major priorities. So where do you see the US debate and the US approach to this issue going under Biden administration?
Great. No, thank you. It's a really good way to frame the issue overall. And, I think there's a lot of different layers to unpack. So I will touch upon a few of them, but it's a complex conversation and set of issues in terms of understanding how these different tensions butt up against each other. I think one thing I want to mention just from the outset is that when it comes to using advanced surveillance tools for a variety of government interests, whether it's national security, public order, public health, or so on, it's not a new tactic that we're seeing. It's not as if surveillance is something that has only in the last few years become a major tool for governments to use for a variety of objectives. In fact, surveillance is something that for decades governments have relied upon in different forms. And so, one thing that we have to bear in mind is that there is a long tradition in democracies like the United States, in countries like Russia, in authoritarian states like China, of using different modes of surveillance to accomplish government objectives, public objectives. The difference that we're seeing now is that whereas in the past maybe they were cruder mechanisms, wiretaps, or I think lots of physical surveillance, just people. You look at a place like East Germany in the Stasi, in the Cold War. There you had close to 1 million different members of the Stasi actually tracking physically and watching suspected challengers and dissenters to the regime. Now we're starting to see a transformation, particularly in places like China, where they're reliant more and more on automated processes, the use of big data analysis and artificial intelligence to track and monitor civilians' actions, whatever they may be. So, in other words, it's not that we're seeing a paradigm shift where surveillance is a new thing. What we're seeing is I think, advancement and a deepening in the ability of these technologies to further the intrusive reach of the state towards whatever set of objectives they may have, whether it's for legitimate public health purposes or whether it's to further political objectives. So that's kind of just point one. I think it's interesting you mentioned the point about China. I want to also touch upon that for a second, in that you're right. China has really trumpeted the fact that its sort of omni-surveillance state, the use of facial recognition cameras, QR codes tied to smartphones, other sorts of advanced surveillance techniques, has been a key part of its response and a fairly effective response to the coronavirus. But I do think there's a flaw in China's argument that's worth bearing in mind, in that there are many other countries, particularly in the region, in East Asia, that have also had equally effective responses to the coronavirus, that have not relied nearly to the same degree on technology, on this type of this prevalent surveillance that China has, but have also had very effective outcomes. So Japan is a good case in point. Taiwan is another country that's in a place that's worth mentioning. And in those situations, I think the difference is that you have to ask, what is the underlying rationale for how your government asserts power and control over society? In China, it's coercion, alongside some other elements, but coercion is a very key plank to how they actually decide to enact and accomplish their objectives. So therefore, it makes sense that they believe surveillance is such an important part of responding to the coronavirus. In other countries like Japan, there's a much different mix when it comes to social cohesion and the legitimate belief in following government mandates when it comes to wearing masks, social distancing, and so forth. So therefore, the coercive element, the surveillance element, is not nearly as important. So what China proposes and argues is a strength. The use of surveillance, actually, I would argue, is a weakness of a political system that is heavily reliant on using government force to compel people to follow mandates, as opposed to actually exercising a legitimate authority that makes people want to follow what the government advises is the best way to combat the coronavirus. So we can turn to the Biden administration in a second, but maybe before I do that, I want to let me turn it back over to you for a second, just to see if you want to follow up on that before I shift over U.S. policy.
Yeah, I think that perfectly sets the stage, and that's very interesting. So I think that going into direction Biden administration is very interesting. Before we do that, I think that I will abuse my power as a moderator and host of this event and try to grill Stephen with a couple of questions and open some arguments that are very frequent in my conversation with senior Russian officials, because I think that you see a lot learning or desire to learn on the side of the Russian government and some governments in Central Asia that I talk to, where people say, hey, but actually in China, that's very efficient. And that's probably the way to go. So I throw all of this kind of devil's advocate arguments on you, Steve, and let you push back a little bit, and then we discuss. But we also want to provide the opportunity for the audience to ask questions. And there will be about 20 or 25 minutes to do so, and we need to wrap up in about 50 minutes. So we will enable you to ask questions using two very simple ways. One is to use the chat function in the YouTube, so you can ask your questions there, and they will be transferred to me as a moderator, or you can use Twitter, and then you need to tag Carnegie Russia account and ask your question via Twitter. So Steve, what's the Biden administration approach to cope with that?
Right. Well, in terms of coping with The balance on surveillance, or the kind of general response to the coronavirus as it relates to surveillance?
I think that it's interesting what will be the approach of the Biden administration to striking the right balance between government access to data and citizens' liberties.
Right.
And also, I think a very important element here that pops up very frequently in conversations in Russia, for example, but I also know that that's one of the major trend lines in debating those issues in China. What about Facebook? What about the big media companies? Whenever we discuss something using our iPhone, I open my feed on Facebook and immediately something pops up that relates to the conversation that I just had. So it looks like a lot of our conversations are recorded or tapped by Facebook algorithms, and then using keywords, there is some targeted advertisement. So probably it's not kind of personalized, and it's all anonymized data analyzed by AI, but it enables the company to know a lot about my personal life. So what's the discussion on how to regulate that as well? And then the third element to this is there any idea to come up with a framework that will enable global regulation on that, and whether there is a subject of transatlantic discussion between the European Union and the US? Because obviously one of major Biden's priority is to repair the relationship with allies, and I think that the regulation of digital global commons, including surveillance, is one of the major topics on the minds of European decision makers right now.
Yeah, those are great questions. I'm gonna do my best to do justice to them. But let me start. I'll talk about the framework maybe in a moment. But let me start with the first two, and let me start actually with the surveillance, the balance between government interests for surveillance and civil liberties. So I think what we have currently with the Trump administration is we have sort of two problems that the Biden administration needs to think seriously about. I think, first of all, you have a lot of rhetoric coming from Trump when it comes to the ability of government forces to confront Black Lives Matter protests, civil protests, and so forth, that has veered in very dangerous, somewhat authoritarian directions, at least in terms of what the words that have come out of his mouth have indicated. Now, I don't think actions have completely supported what some of the times what Trump has said, but nonetheless, it's been alarming if you care about civil liberties and the balance between what types of tactics and techniques security forces, police forces ought to have, and how to preserve and protect the ability of journalists to do their job, of protesters to express themselves, and so on. And so, on one level, I think this sort of dangerous rhetoric where Trump has really pushed for a crackdown on those who are protesting for justice, racial justice issues, or protesting against his administration's policies. I think that, first of all, that rhetoric will shift dramatically under Biden. So there's no question. So I think where you had a message and signal coming from the top, coming from someone like Trump, basically sort of saying, like, weighing in favor of greater capacity and capabilities for police forces, that'll change. Now, the second question, though, is that in the U.S. system, it's a federalist system, which means that many of the decisions when it comes to local police forces, different, National Guard and so forth, that report to states, many of those decisions really lie outside the jurisdiction of the federal government, which means that the individual decisions for, let's say, the NYPD to use social media monitoring, mass surveillance techniques, to use predictive policing algorithms to determine crime hotspots. These are not decisions that actually relate directly to the presidency. And so even under a Biden administration, well, I think there will be a push to reform and change the way that police departments collect data of citizens and use surveillance. I don't think the shift will happen overnight. And we have to remember the fact that these jurisdictions operate independently because that's the way that our system is set up. It's not a unified national system, right? And so even in that sense, I think we can't expect, like with a snap of the fingers on January 20th, for a Biden administration to come in and all of a sudden these issues dissipate. I think they will continue to be a tension domestically when it comes to that kind of balance. Now, you asked the question next about internet platforms, and that really kind of relates to a second sort of set of surveillance issues, which is sort of this capitalist surveillance data privacy exploitation model. And it's the notion that, internet platforms, search engines, whether it's YouTube, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth, are mining their users' data in order to increase their revenue. And this is a real problem. And this is something that a lot of people recognize, that there needs to be at least some reforms or some kind of regulation in that regard. So what I would expect is that, again, they're tricky issues, and there's a lot of different ideas about how to handle those. I mean, there's very extreme ideas in terms of breaking up the platforms, more moderate ideas when it comes to creating a data privacy regulation. There's other ideas in terms of having, a degree of voluntary, kind of constraint when it comes to how the platforms will operate and what types of data they ought to be allowed to take and where they need to get consent. The problem is right now there isn't a real unified approach. There isn't a regulatory framework in place at all. And so in the absence of that, you have a vacuum where companies will continue to exploit personal data to the extent they can because it equals profits. And in the meantime, I think there's been a deferral to regulatory authorities in Europe and other places to set the rules because the US hasn't been in a position to want to do so. My sense is that is also something that under the Biden administration, the idea of data privacy will be taken more seriously, but it's not going to happen overnight. You need to staff up the agencies, you need to build consensus, and you need to figure out where there is a political unanimity between Republicans and Democrats to actually do something serious, and then how much political capital will Biden want to spend dealing with this issue, particularly on day one. I would guess it'll happen in time, but it won't be something that out of the starting gate, we can expect a ton of action right away. We can talk to the global side in a second. Let me stop there for a second and see if you have anything you want to respond back to before we kind of go to the transnational issues.
I think that having heard what you said, it looks to me that it's very unlikely that the US under Biden will be the leader in setting up the model on what's the right way to strike a balance between the corporate interests and the interests of the citizens. Because to me, that's also a pretty charged subject in the US, and you are absolutely right, it needs to stuff the agencies and reach a consensus on the Capitol Hill, which will be very difficult to do given the balance between the two parties. So probably it's more logical to expect that the European Commission will come up with some creative, smart ideas, because we know that the Europeans love to regulate everything and rein in wild capitalist instincts of American companies. So probably there will be a more kind of forceful and creative regulatory response out there.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that, I mean, as soon as in the next few weeks even, the Europeans are expected to roll out the Digital Services Act, which will be a pretty comprehensive framework for addressing these very issues when it comes to the balance of different interests, particularly when it comes to content regulation of platforms, and in terms of what type of speech ought to be allowed and where there is liability and where there isn't. This is slightly separate from the data privacy surveillance issue that we talked about, but it's related because it ultimately gets to how platforms operate and what kind of rules of the road will be associated with those entities. And so, I think what's interesting is that on the one hand, Europe has already been working a policy process for the last couple of years. So you're seeing the culmination of that. And frankly, they're just, they're faster out of the starting gate. So even if the Biden administration comes in and says grappling with these issues is a top priority, they're behind the curve because Europe has already gotten there. But that being said, I will also say that, ultimately these tech companies are based in the United States. And so while Europe can regulate from a consumer perspective, there's a lot of room left for the US to weigh in and to really, I think, come in with some sound, well-principled rules for how things ought to work going forward. So I think will remain a lot of room and a lot of need for the Biden administration to kind of seize the policy mantle on this issue if they so choose.
Do you have a sense on where the American public is on this issue? Because I don't think that we have, like, this issue is very new to Russia, and the city government of Moscow is kind of the trendsetter here because they are very active in building the camera system and surveillance system in Moscow, then connecting all the cameras that you have in different apartment blocks on the streets into one system, and then increasingly using the algorithms. Like, they're mostly, like, the cameras are mostly China imported by the core of the system. The hardware is mostly from American companies, and then the algorithms are of Russian design. And so far, I don't think that we have enough data to support the case that this has been efficient during the pandemic. To me, it looks like from circumstantial evidence, the system hasn't been very efficient. And my own explanation is that in China, you both have the kind of modern IT surveillance states, but you also have a very traditional surveillance state that you mentioned on the onset, like a giant Stasi. So you have a lot of old women and men sitting in every block who are volunteer informants for the police. And you have a large kind of traditional police body that can enable and connect the real surveillance and punitive measures around those who kind of violate quarantine and the digital kind of tracing of those people. In Russia, you don't have that. Our police force is smaller and it's aimed at very different things. It's just basic police work and then crack down on very narrowly defined political dissent. But overall, like, talking to people, and again, it's a very random sample. We haven't had a national survey on this. You have two schools of thought. One school of thought says, hey, why would anybody infringe on my liberties? That's just bad. I don't want that. And another school of thought which says, hey, but look at the crime rates in countries like Ecuador. Like, Ecuador has imported this system from China, and within just 1 year, I think the crime rate has dropped for 20%. A lot of circumstantial evidence, just looking at my friends, they say, hey, like, being violent in a street quarrel when you are having a quarrel with a driver driving next to you and you stop your car, you exit, and then 5 years back, you would punch the guy in the face. Now you don't do that because there are cameras all over. So we have a lot of circumstantial evidence that normal crime rate is going down, but also kind of occasional street violence is also going down because people are afraid, and that this massive surveillance also drives public behavior in a kind of non-violent way. And people say, hey, I don't like being watched, but that's probably a good thing. So that's kind of just glimpse of where the discussion, which is not a national debate, is in Russia. So where is the debate in the US, given how polarized the society is, obviously, across various other issues?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, you know, it's interesting because I feel like the statistics when it comes to the actual crime effectiveness of a lot of these systems, I don't think that there's really a consensus in terms of findings, and that, a lot of the reasons for why crime is dropping could be very well caused by other factors. So even if there's a relationship, it doesn't mean that the crime drop is caused because of the use of these cameras. And the other thing too is it's really hard to measure the chilling effect that a camera has. Essentially, you're trying to measure behavior that has not occurred, and that becomes, a little tenuous. So I think the jury's out in terms of whether these systems are actually effective or not. But certainly anecdotally, London, the UK, were one of the first places in the world to establish at scale a mass surveillance CCTV camera system, in part to get at the threat from IRA terrorist bombings, 20 years ago. But it's something now where I think London is the most heavily surveilled urban center in the world, or at least on par with places that you would expect, Moscow and Beijing and so forth. So, it is something that's pretty widespread. I think in the US, there's sort of two, I think we need to break down the issue into two parts. So there's a bigger question of, to what extent does the public either trust or are they open to the type of surveillance systems that you've mentioned in terms of facial recognition cameras, CCTV, and having those link up with police forces. And I would say that there generally is an inherent distrust of government power built in to a large portion of US citizens. And you can see that in terms of just the lack of adherence to the mask mandates, for example, and the trouble that we've seen when it comes to getting people to do something that's fairly benign in terms of their own good, let alone, kind of deploying something that many people see as coercive, when it comes to cameras. So, my sense is that to get to a point where either deployment at scale of facial recognition cameras, or a more heavier reliance on mass surveillance techniques, I think that not only is there pushback now, but there will be more and more of a backlash against using those techniques. I think that's just part of the kind of DNA of American society, is to be inherently distrustful of governmental authority. And so I don't see that this changing that perspective by a huge amount. But what's interesting, though, I think, the secondary question would be, to what extent do people accept the exploitation and use and mining of their data for commercial reasons? To what extent are people, maybe they are, a little bit upset by the fact that Facebook commodifies and monetizes their personal information, or Google does the same, and yet the numbers show something else, which is that people continue to use these platforms in ever greater numbers, certainly in the US context. So even if people are upset by, and I think at this point, there's at least a basic awareness that Facebook makes money from your data, right? Even if you know very little as a, kind of US citizen about what it actually means when it comes to platforms accessing your information, I think people generally know that Google figures out your patterns and your search patterns, and then uses that to place targeted ads that will appeal to you, that'll be clickable, right? And so people in the US tend to, I think, be distrustful of that model, and yet reliant enough that they are willing to go along with this bargain regardless. And I'm not sure that that's going to significantly change, although there does seem to be a nascent and growing privacy awareness set of principles that I think is gaining in political power in the United States, which is why I do have hope that there will be a more more regulation that's consistent on privacy, data privacy in the US in the coming years.
It's very interesting that you mentioned this trust towards the government, which to me is one of the key elements here, because if there is a government that you trust, which comes with a very transparent argument saying, hey guys, there is a balance between public security and private liberties, and we need to strike the right balance. But if you have trust in our institutions, in independent judiciary, and that we do that not to kind of sustain us in power, but just to protect public safety and security. So if you trust us, we'll strike the balance this way. And then there is a public debate, there is discussion in the parliament, and then there are some norms and regulations that are done a certain way. So it's interesting because in Russia and in China, we would expect Western democratic societies trust their governments more than we trust ours, because here I think that there is like two streams. One is, are they going to spy on us regardless, because it's not it doesn't matter what's written in the law. The FSB, like the security state, will do that regardless. So it's inevitable. Why should I fret about it too much? And then some advocacy groups around that won't really help in Russian context. So we should just relax and probably seek ways to minimize your digital footprint and many other techniques if you are really fretting about the state of infringing of your civil liberties. But then, those guys in the West, they at least can trust their government, and they know that the FBI and New York Police Department will not go after dissidents. I think that's the prevailing mood here. So it's very interesting that the real picture is very different because of kind of traditional distrust towards big government and government in general by the American public. We are getting very interesting questions already I remind everybody that there is a way to ask your question. There are two ways to ask your questions. One is to use the chat feed in YouTube channel, and the other is to go on Twitter and tag Carnegie Russia Twitter account and to ask your question towards Steve. Okay, shall we go into the global regulation and geopolitical competition around that? I think that there is a notion that authoritarian China wants to spread its model, and it advocates this model and probably wants some elements of its domestic model to be enshrined in the global regulation, and will come up with some creative ideas. At the same time, we have voices in the incoming Biden team that say, no, we need to seize this momentum and exercise leadership and charter these rules. Otherwise, China and other authoritarian states will charter that for the rest of the world. So where do you see the Biden administration going on that?
Yeah, no, that's something I've been thinking a lot about. And, I would sort of say this, first of all, that, on a broader scale, I think there was a point in the past where we could, sort of reasonably hope that even if there were countries coming from very different perspectives, like China and Russia and some of the liberal democracies in the West, that there would be an ability to find a sliver of consensus about how certain aspects of surveillance online and so forth ought to work. But I think that that's really broken away in the last 5 or so years, and that this whole idea of the kind of cyber sovereignty agenda that you see from Russia, China, and Iran that's being pushed globally versus kind of an free and open internet set of principles that continues to be espoused by liberal democracies, I think those differences have only sharpened. So I think, as a starting point, I think achieving kind of a global consensus about where does data privacy begin and where does government surveillance end, I'm not sure that's possible. I do think that there's a growing movement between, especially between the transatlantic countries, to find consensus on these issues, but both to counteract a perceived digital authoritarian push by China and others, and also to set some common rules when it comes to surveillance standards and related issues. And so, just a couple of days ago, the Financial Times highlighted a proposal that's making the rounds in the EU about proposing a democracy alliance that would be centered around transatlantic members between the United States and the EU, but that would then extend to a broader set of democracies that would sort of hold some kind of higher level goals as its core objectives, including countering China's authoritarian tendencies, finding common ground when it comes to tech regulation, digital regulation, and sort of setting the stage for this to be kind of a foundational pillar to how this type of partnership would operate. And so this is maybe Europe's way to kind of extend a hand initially and say, we want to partner. Are you with us, United States? And I can tell you that not the full team has yet to be announced for Biden, but the people who already have been announced for nomination very much see things in this light. People like Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, Linda Thomas Greenfield, Avril Haines, many of the others that we now know of at the top, who are directly advising the president, the incoming president-elect, on how to approach these tough issues. They very much see alliances and finding a way for democracies to work together to counteract some of these troubling, surveillance, censorship, and other sorts of digital issues. They very much see an alliance as a core means of tackling these threats. So I would expect to see a lot of action on that front in the coming months that might culminate by the end of 2021 with the Democracy Summit, where much of this is sort of codified in a more formal way on these issues.
Okay, it's interesting. So I think that the conclusion would be that we are very unlikely to see a unified approach or even a platform where great powers and other powers that might be thought leaders would come together with a unified approach here. And I don't think that there is a good platform for discussion. Like, is it the UN? Is it the Global Council for Communication Industry? It's very unclear. And that the approach that you described, that there will be a joint or coordinated effort between the democratic allies of the US in Europe and probably in Asia, if we are talking Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the US, Canada, and others, will be one camp. And there will be other camp which will not necessarily agree on the same principles, but where there will be a lot of countries looking up to China as a model. And again, a reminder that China's model is not just about the surveillance per se. I think that the goal that the Xi Jinping administration are pursuing is a much more ambitious one. It's the creation of the so-called social credit system that the State Council of China has been discussing just last week. And the idea is to pool all the data available on an individual together and give him a rank of like 1,000 points. And then this rank will increase or decrease depending on your behavior. And that behavior will definitely be approved by the party. And digital surveillance will play a huge role in monitoring your conduct and then shaping your conduct. So it's a very different model from even kind of the narrow police use or health authorities use of the digital surveillance. It's very interesting. I know that it attracts a lot of attention here in Russia and in other kind of authoritarian regimes in the post-Soviet space. So I think we are starting to receive some interesting question here. I think that question one that we get from Georgi from Russia is, do you think that there is an amount of privacy that is worth sacrificing for more security? So what's the proportion? Will be people ready to sacrifice part of their privacy for the sake of safety, like they do, for example, in London nowadays?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's really harkens back to issues that governments across the world have grappled with for many years. Right now there's sort of an international norm that kind of describes when it's appropriate to use surveillance or other restrictions and when it's not. And it uses three principles that underlie this framework. One is it's necessity, proportionality, and legitimacy. And so it really asks, to what extent is the use of the surveillance measures, are they necessary to accomplish the legitimate national security or public order objectives of the state? And to what extent is this use proportional to the threat that otherwise is apparent? And so that to me is kind of the starting point, because you have to assume that government's one of the fundamental functions of a state is to protect its citizens and have a monopoly on the use of violence, particularly against adversaries, both internal and external. And so in order to do so, the use of these tools is an essential part of the function. What most people are concerned with, though, is how do you guard against abuse? How do you come up with a template that sort of says this is acceptable, this is legitimate, and this is not? And so the principles I described, I think, is a good starting point for asking these questions and applying a rule in terms of saying, this type of action, this surveillance measure is something that we can justify, or this is an overreach, that, the mass surveillance, facial camera, powered techniques in X city is far too much as an infringement on the civil liberties of a country's citizens.
Okay. We have a very interesting question here from, I don't see who that comes from, Lirina. What are your ideas on possible use of digital financial instruments like e-wallets and others for surveillance and control? And I think that's also very interesting in the Chinese context, because there is a lot of notion on digital yuan, digital RMB, as a way to promote it as a global currency to substitute US dollars or challenge US dollars dominance. But to me and multiple Carnegie colleagues, it's much more about internal domestic control over flow of money. So the idea is to get rid of cash and to have government issued digital currency that will be totally monitored by the state, and that will eliminate a lot of kind of dark activity like corruption, crime, but also put a lot of transactions under the watchful eye of the Chinese Communist Party. So do you think that spread of these instruments in Europe and the United States will also push the governments to monitor that more closely, to regulate that, and create a temptation to use that as a tool for financial control or political control? Because obviously in the US, taxation and paying taxes is a big issue, starting with Mr. Trump, obviously. So there is a push for more control and instruments that will allow to do that.
Right. Well, yeah, no, I'm certainly, it's an interesting issue. I mean, I think regardless of whether there's an intentional move to shift to electronic payment systems, or whether it's just happening by circumstance, it's happening. It's a trend, right? That we are moving more and more away from being a cashless society. In my own life, my use of cash, particularly, with the pandemic, it's pretty minimal. So everything, once we made a decision to adopt e-commerce, and once we made a decision to increasingly rely on platforms like Amazon or Alibaba or eBay or others to conduct our shopping, you can't use cash in those situations. And so it's inevitable that we're moving more to electronic payments. And then the question just becomes, to what extent is there an interest or a capability by the state to monitor those flows, to do so in a more particularized manner, and how does this intersect with its political objectives? And that's where I think I am exceedingly much more distrustful of authoritarian states who rely upon coercion as a means to political survival than I am in democracies, where I think there's a much more circumscribed interest in tracking flows that are tied to illicit activities, but not towards a mass surveillance objectives. I would also note too that, even if we do get to a world where cash becomes, fairly unknown and it's all electronic payments, that doesn't mean it's the end of the story. The rise of cryptocurrencies in particular, I think, will continue to offer viable alternatives for people who want to have a degree of anonymity when it comes to conducting their transactions. So as technology changes the way we do things, innovations continue to kind of make it a bit of a cat and mouse game when it comes to those who desire privacy for whatever reasons they have, and governments who want to exert more control over their citizens' actions.
Okay. There is also a question whether Biden administration will be positioned to have new agreement with the EU, and under this agreement, the US would commit to same level of protection of privacy like the European data protection law, GDPR. Is that conceivable in the US context at all?
Well, I don't think we're going to get to a point where the US simply adopts equivalent measures to GDPR, because I think there are a very different set of interests and a different way of conceiving the balance between how platforms and other companies will operate, and how citizens ought to safeguard their personal data. So I don't think we're close. What I do think is that there will probably be, over the next 3-4 years, a greater push to at least enact some basic parameters when it comes to how citizen privacy ought to be protected, and what kind of regulations potentially apply, whether it's a voluntary or whether it's more directed against different online platforms and internet companies. So my sense is that we'll see a greater shift in that direction, and there will be common ground on certain issues between Europe and the United States, but I don't foresee a wholesale adoption of the European perspective on privacy, GDPR, in the near future.
There is a question coming from Claudia Vasquez-Hampton, and that's a question to me. Are there similar concerns from the public in Russia regarding algorithms biases that affect minorities in terms of race, gender, like there are in the US, specifically for biometric technology and data collection? And my answer is no, and particularly because the experiments in Russia are very limited. So far, it's really about Moscow City not everybody in Moscow City is really aware of the scale of the program and the face recognition algorithms. So I think that the concern that I described, or an additional degree of caution that people are more cautious about the way of their behavior in the streets, is more about something can be recorded, and then the guy writes a complaint to the police, and I might be found because of kind of some techniques, but not that people believe that there will be an inbuilt bias with regard to that. But it might pop up because we know that there is a lot of inbuilt racism in the Russian society, a lot of distrust towards minorities, but particularly people coming from the Caucasus. Random stop and asking for documents in the Moscow police definitely mostly targets people who look like they're from Caucasus and not kind of powerful Chechens, or migrant workers from Central Asia, or foreigners who can be kind of extorted for a bribe. But I think that concern about some biases might pop up in the future. Is this a concern in the US as well? Do you notice that, Steve?
It is. Yeah, it's a big concern. I think, particularly when it comes to, Latino and Black populations and policing, there's been a pretty well-established literature that says, predictive policing algorithms, that are built on faulty data that already has a bias against certain types of populations, is magnifying and exacerbating a bad problem. And that sentencing algorithms that try to predict the probability that a particular person will commit a crime or get rearrested in the future are also built on racially biased data. And so, bad data going in leads to bad outcomes going out. And I think there's a strong sense that algorithms as something that should be relied upon as a policing tool in the United States is a really bad road to go down. But I would sort of throw back to you. What I think is interesting is that in the Russia context, I would potentially be less concerned about inadvertent, implicit bias when it comes to, facial recognition cameras picking up or predictive policing algorithms, targeting certain populations more than others, but not doing so in a directed way. I mean, I would actually sort of think that there explicitly has been such a history of persecution of minority populations, as you mentioned, that these tools might directly feed into those practices and accentuate those even further. That would be for me a sort of a primary concern, particularly in the Russia context. Do you think that's true? Do you share that as well?
I would agree to that. The problem is that these are really minorities that are pretty silent, and I think that the most vulnerable community here will be the migrant workers, who are not necessarily Russian citizens, who are here. Like, many of them are not fully legal, so they exist in the gray zone, and that's a big part of corruption between developers, the city government, and various companies that bring this labor from places like Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan or Uzbekistan. And I think that the police partly targets them because they're a real source of crime, but also because they are really a great opportunity to enrich themselves, because they are afraid to be kicked off of the country, and they're constantly kind of paying various amounts of bribes collectively and individually if they get kind of stopped and caught. So I think that really adds to their anxiety, but they don't have too many advocacy groups in the Russian context to push back against excessive use of those tools. And then I think that people coming from the proper Russia, the Caucasus republics in the south, like Chechnya or Ossetia or Ingushetia, that also might be a risk, but there I think that we will have much more vocal protection coming from their leaders like Ramzan Kadyrov or others. So I think that they are of less concern, but definitely that will be an issue. I think that we have about less than 10 minutes to ask your questions. Two ways to do that. One is to use the chat function in YouTube. The other is to go on Twitter and tag Carnegie Russia account. We have a question on cooperation on fighting terrorism. The question is that usually the agencies tasked with fighting terrorism do that when something happens. So there is a bombing at the Boston Marathon, and then the FBI reaches out to their Russian colleagues and then provides some information. And like the Russian always complain that we have warned the Americans that this family is kind of suspicious, but then there was no reaction. So now we have a lot of data in various airports, and we can basically monitor global moves of various people that we attribute to various terrorist or radical groups 24/7. The problem is that the cameras are installed in various jurisdictions where the security services don't necessarily trust each other. And if something terrible happens, then we might have a joint investigation task force and some exchange of information. So is there a way to close that gap and exchange data on kind of really suspicious people and people that we all agree are terrorists or potential terrorists?
Yeah. Well, I think you're describing a political problem, not a technological problem. And it has to do with the relations that we have between different countries that have an extreme amount of distrust and frankly are adversaries in a variety of contexts. And so you got to ask yourself first and foremost is, between Russia and the United States, is there really a consensus when it comes to, let's say, a terrorist watch list? And how do you trust that the people that one country puts on aren't actually, legitimate dissidents or people that another country doesn't consider to be dangerous, but instead are challengers to the regime? And, unfortunately, like the case, especially with countries that are autocratic, is that very often these type of national security rationales are exploited for political survival reasons, as opposed to confronting legitimate national security issues. So that's kind of, a big part of it. I mean, I will say that certainly among democracies, there's, for example, the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement the U.S. and other allied countries already have when it comes to data sharing for terrorist-related content. So it does exist. I guess, question is, will that type of data sharing understanding extend further? And, I'll go back to my original point. It's a political question.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree, and that's the problem that we run into in Syrian context. Like, which groups do we label as terrorists or radical, which are not, and which is basically very political in nature. There was one more question on the protection of data and cybercrime. So is there a way to agree on integrity of data and access to data that we agree on the blacklist of hackers and various malign groups that want to extort those data and use that for various kind of illegal activities? Is there a way to agree for joint combat on this group? I think that it's also, it's probably the same, that it's more a political question rather than a technological question.
Yeah, I'm smiling on two levels. So, number one, if that applied to actors who spread disinformation to manipulate elections, it would seem to me that the United States and Russia continue to have significant differences on those issues, whether it's groups like the IRA, sponsored by the Russian state, which U.S. intelligence agencies have verified, certainly in 2016, manipulated or attempted to manipulate U.S. elections. The question isn't, can we agree upon a list of, black hat hackers who are disrupting the global system, when in fact it is actually hackers sponsored by government agencies who are directly attempting to undermine rival countries. And so then it goes back to the question, well, how do you get at an issue like that other than to have an agreement that government-sponsored hackers and government-sponsored cyber attacks there are certain areas that are off limits, and that the general sponsorship of that type of disruptive behavior is unacceptable. Again, the technology comes second in my mind. The actual incentives and motivations and resourcing are the real questions, and that gets back to the intelligence agencies and the national security apparatuses of different states in terms of making decisions about what is in their interests to support and where ought there to be more agreement about disallowing or prohibiting certain types of behavior.
Thanks, Stephen. I think that my conclusion is not a very optimistic one. It's that it looks like the general agreement, or at least common framework to think about those issues, will remain very different in authoritarian states and in democratic states. And even within democratic states, there will be a lot of debates on which model is the best. And like there will be a lot of experimenting in Europe, in the US, and then finding a pathway in the US context might be particularly tricky given the political situation and the differences between the administration and the two parties on the Capitol Hill, plus the commercial interests of powerful digital platforms and companies. But also finding a way to talk about those issues and regulate that globally with countries like Russia and China will be increasingly challenges. And then compartmentalizing this kind of bigger values divide on the balance between public safety, public liberties, and the ability of the authoritarian state to abuse those and frame a political survival issue as a public security issue are there, and they are not very easy to fix. But even attempting to address issues like what about sharing data on terrorists? What about kind of jointly fighting groups that might mine data or abuse data and are acting as hackers will be very tricky to do because of various political obstacles and definitions coming from two rivaling or multiple rivaling great powers. I think that's very much the conclusion.
Yeah, I think you synthesized it very well.
Well, then it adds to the utility of talking about those issues, and I think that it's great that there are platforms like Carnegie where you have American scholars, Russian scholars, Indians, Arabs, Chinese, Europeans, that we can at least try to find this language to talk through those issues and at least try to mitigate and minimize the risks that might stem from this increased competition between the great power, including the digital realm. I thank you very much, Stephen. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. And it's really nice to hear questions from, I think, primarily more of a Russian audience, which is something that in my day-to-day work, I get less access to. So thank you, Sasha, for the invitation to have a really fascinating conversation and to continue thinking about these issues and where things go forward, particularly as in the United States, we have a new administration and potentially some shifts.
Terrific.